Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Curious Minds of 2022. A special welcome to the many people who've joined us this evening from many parts of the world, as I see. And a little preface to this meeting this evening. For many years, it's been our custom to dedicate one of our lecture meetings to the memory of Kenneth MacAlpin, not the early medieval King of Scots, but the treasure of our society from 1944 until 1990. This year meeting on Zoom has changed many of our customs, but not this one. In fact, it allows us the special pleasure of welcoming Kenneth MacAlpin's son, Donald Maxwell, who is joining us live from New York and takes a keen interest in our society. So special welcome to Donald. Kenneth MacAlpin was an omnivorous polymath. He was born in Nyasaland, now Malawi, into a Scottish missionary family. He was Scotland's first full-time geography teacher and the last to teach in Perth Academy's Rose Terrace premises. He was a keen admirer of Patrick Geddes, another member of our society, and a family friend of William Souter, the poet after whom our usual meeting place is named. His wide interests included all sorts of historical and botanical and anthropological subjects, and he would definitely have enjoyed this evening's lecture. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Greg Kenneser, a botanist at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh. His PhD looked at the DNA, diversity, and the evolution of pulses, and was based largely in Tokyo. After this, he returned to Edinburgh to work at the Royal Botanic Gardens on the Flora Celtica. And now, some 20 years later, he works in the education department. This involves many activities: researching the evolution and diversity of vetches, peas and their allies, traditional plant use in Scotland, introducing people to the wonders of the seashore, and even the botanical aspects of gin. In addition to academic papers, he has written Scottish Plant Lore and Illustrated Flora and Plant Magic. This looks at the role of plants in Europe's supernatural and magical traditions, and includes chapters on witchcraft, divination, and hallucinogens. And tonight he's going to speak to us about Scottish plant lore. As usual, there'll be a question time at the end. If you think of a question, you can use the chat function on Zoom to send in your question whenever you think of it, and we'll serve these up to Dr. Kenneser at the end. So I would now like to welcome Dr. Greg Kenneser to speak to us. Thanks very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. And hello, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to speak to you. We'll do our best on Zoom. I think we've spent obviously a long time over the last year and a bit with Zoom presentations, so we're getting to be a bit veteran, but you can never trust. They're always a bit tricksy. So if for any reason I duck out at all or things shut down, it shouldn't be long to come back in. We've got our emergency phone numbers if we want. So this evening, we'll have a look at part of one of my specialities. Now, I hope that's okay. This is the only thing I would just check. Has that screen come up okay? Oh, perfect.
Yes.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. We will look at Scottish plant lore, which is something I've had an interest in for a long time. And ultimately, I think, as David mentioned there, we kind of distilled lots of works by some beautiful botanical illustrators, or the botanical illustrators were beautiful, but their illustrations were beautiful as well, into a book at the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh called Scottish Plant Lore. And this draws on some illustrations from that for various parts of this talk. So we'll have a bit of a look at the kind of context, first of all, for how people use plants and used plants in Scotland. And of course, it's very similar to what you see across much of the rest of the globe in terms of the motivations for people using plants, the ways that people use plants as well. But every geographical area has its own particular kind of, if you like, endemic uses of plants as well, which are particularly interesting ones. And there's also a whole host of shared ideas that move around. We'll take a little bit of a kind of habitat-based tour through from the seashore up to the mountaintops and look at a few different plants as we go. And we'll maybe say a little bit about Scottish plant names as well, which is another really quite fascinating area that we're looking at for research just now. So without further ado, we can hopefully, there we go, have a wee look at the overview of the Scottish flora and the kind of the other associated sort of plant-like organisms that there are. And it's quite interesting when you look at what we think of often as the flora. We'd often think of these as the seed plants, and we've got around between 10 and perhaps 1,200 different, so 1,000 to kind of 1,200 different seed plant species in Scotland, which is actually quite a small proportion, relatively speaking, of what you find in the world. And we seem to have a disproportionately high number of species of things like mosses and lichens, the algae and the fungi as well. Now, in part, that's because of there's been a greater body of research in Scotland, looking at, and in the British Isles more widely, looking at these slightly more obscure groups. But also, of course, it's because they're more mobile. They can move by spores. Because the big thing for our flora was that until the end of the Ice Age, it was a clean slate, effectively. And everything has come in since the end of the Ice Age, either under its own steam or it's been brought in by humans. And that was kind of exacerbated, if you like, by the fact that the British Isles became islands, and that Great Britain was an island from around sort of 6,000 years before the present. Now, we have some really wonderful little relics, and in Perthshire, of course, you should be hopefully very familiar with many of these really interesting montane plants. And what I'll just mention is Sibbaldea. And in terms of its uses, it doesn't really have any particular uses, but it's a beautifully widespread plant. You can find the same species in the Rockies. And of course, this is the one that's named in honour of Robert Sibbald, who was the founder of the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And I'll come back to him in a little bit. He's a really fascinating character. Of course, he was also the first person to describe the blue whale, and he became within a hair's breadth of having the blue whale named after him. So it's sometimes called Sibbald's Rorqual, the blue whale, but someone else pipped him at the post, and it's now something like Balanoptera, a bit of a useless name, you know. So I have to say, Robert Sibbald being honoured by this little kind of innocuous mountain plant is probably a bit more tasteful than the big brash blue whale. Now, if we look at the kind of context, I think, for what we have in Scotland in terms of plant uses, it's kind of often seen as kind of very fringe in Europe in terms of what's been going on. Lots of the really interesting stuff that was recorded early in history is down through kind of Mesopotamia and through the Mediterranean. Innovations in farming, for example, in the Neolithic, all happened around that part of the world, and the ideas spread sort of slowly but surely. But as ideas of farming moved, you'd also have ideas of uses of other plants, and that would have been going on even before farming. And these ideas would often shift along with seeds as well. So it's not just our native flora that is the kind of key to how people use plants. It's actually lots of introduced things as well. So I'll maybe make a wee mention of them, but you've got successive groups of different peoples and different ideas coming in through the past 3, 4, 5,000 years, bringing in all these ideas and plants as well. But you also have these interesting little endemic local ideas that seem to be invented spontaneously in Scotland. And as I say, that's what you find almost anywhere else in the world. There are the local ideas, but also lots of shared ideas, and also some really quite intriguing coincidental ideas where unconnected cultures often seem to have mysteriously almost the same concept of how a plant can be used in quite obscure ways as well. This is some of our introductions. These are archaeophytes, both of these. They're plants that have come in sort of maybe more than 400 years ago, and we would normally say these were brought in by the monks or the Romans. We don't quite know who it was that brought them in, but probably Roman influence or later monastic communities were bringing in plants like these. So we've got sweet cicely here, so a member of the carrot family, and one that grows really well through the central belt. So in Perthshire, certainly you'll have lots of sweet cicely that you'll kind of come across. Quite a nice, easy to identify thing with this lovely kind of sweet aniseed smell. And it was used as a pot herb, so used as a flavouring for sweetening things up. But also, of course, it was used as a strewing herb. So you would throw it on the ground, and in medieval times, because you were living in cramped conditions, everybody was sweaty, and the cattle and the sheep were in the same buildings as you, you needed to have that little bit of relief from that. So scattering down this herb and then walking over the top of it, you'd release this kind of quite pleasant, light aniseed scent. So these so-called strewing herbs were considered really quite useful indeed. And the great thing about it is, rather than have to hoover all the time, you could just take a brush, sweep it out the door, and replace it. And you could eat it as well. Imagine that. It's a really versatile plant indeed. This other one, however, this is Ecopodium podagraria, which is often seen as a bit more of a villain. And if you're a gardener and you've got this in your garden, you might think of it as one of the most evil plants there is, but it is wonderful. This is often known as ground elder because it's got these kind of leaves that are very like Sambucus nigra, the elder. It's another member of the carrot family, and again introduced by the monks or the Romans. And it's really quite intriguing. Its name, Ecopodium, and also podagraria, they kind of relate to a thickened foot. And it kind of gives a nice hint as to how it was used, because it was probably a medicinal plant that was brought in and used to treat gout. And of course, that's one of its other names, is goutweed. It's also slightly scurrilously, of course, called bishopweed, in part because of that association with monastic gardens, but also because bishops, with their excessive drinking and their sort of sitting about, lazing around, not doing much, supposedly was the kind of scurrilous tale that people would tell. They would be the ones that would get gout, which is, yeah, and that's what it was used to treat. But yeah, it can be used as a pot herb as well. And foragers, it's very popular with foragers. So even slightly older leaves can be quite tasty, just boiled in spinach, for example. Although you need to eat a lot of it if you've got it in your garden, trying to control it with it runs under the ground with these kind of tough rhizomes is a bit of a challenge. You need to eat a lot of that. But at least it would stave off the gout, possibly. So lots of people beyond our Romans and our monks were bringing in plants and ideas as well. So Irish and Norse and other invaders, like the Romans, for example. And then the Hanseatic traders and all the traders as well, bringing plants into port, sometimes unintentionally as well, really enriched the flora with these different species coming in. And when we're thinking about that, it's quite sort of an interesting set of things we need to do in terms of working out why and how people used plants. When we go back in time to before written records, where people were actually kind of writing things down, which is actually surprisingly recent in terms of plant uses in Scotland, we have to be quite speculative. Archaeological finds can be really, really helpful, but still it's quite difficult to interpret the context of these. If we're extremely lucky, we'll have something like the kind of Bronze Age find of a body that had sphagnum moss packed into their chest, and that's interpreted as using it in the same way as it was used in World War I and later a bit in World War II as well, as a wound dressing. But finds like that, where you have plant being used in a way that seems very easy to interpret, are often really quite challenging indeed. They're quite rare indeed, so it's often quite challenging to work out why a particular plant is being used, and it's a bit dangerous to kind of speculate and to try and tell too many stories about why people were using plants in the past. So we always kind of urge caution for that. One of the other kind of techniques that people look at is looking at kind of comparative use of plants as well. So if more modern groups that have been recorded using similar plants in modern times for particular purposes are written down, then we might assume that people in Scotland might have used similar plants for similar purposes as well. But again, that's purely speculative. It's slightly assuming that if it's possible to use a plant in a particular way, then people will. It's not really until we get the 17th century, there's some bits of records through the 16th century where there's mentions of plants and how they're used. It's not really until the 17th century we start to see people actually thinking to record how plants were used. And it's people like Martin, Robert Sibbald, writing in the kind of early 18th century for some really interesting stuff as well. Thomas Pennant, John Lightfoot, and James Robertson through the 18th century. So James Robertson doing a lot of work through Persia as well. Then a little bit later, you would have many of the Victorian scholars writing things as well, particularly usually writing kind of somewhat derivative accounts of things from what had been recorded in the earlier 18th century. But in the tail end of the 19th century, we have Alexander Carmichael, who's a really interesting character who collects a whole host of really interesting plant uses as part of his research into particularly Gaelic folklore. So people like these, and then more contemporary writers like Mary Beath and Anne Barker and Sam Milliken, William Milliken and Sam Bridgewater, as well as Tess Darwin, are the kind of people that have been recording these plant uses. And certainly these contemporary writers have written some really wonderful books that are very accessible for getting a summary of the uses of plants. But also when you look at linguistic studies, many of the dictionaries in Gaelic and Scots also contain little snippets of how plants were used as well. And they're a really interesting source for information and very, very readable as well, because often the names of these plants give some really interesting hints as to their uses, and they're just interesting in their own rights as well. So people like Robertson, writing in 1768, mentions things like in Arisaig, the inhabitants live miserable lives, both with respect to food and habitations. The houses in which they live they call basket houses, and water them up with heath and small branches of wood. And that's lovely to have these kind of completely contemporary accounts. And I think Robertson's quite careful about how he writes down how plants were used. But these little basket houses is a really, you can imagine that just in Arisaig, over from Rum and Egg. And then people like Lightfoot and Pennant, who were itinerant botanists who were going around, John Lightfoot certainly was, and wrote the original kind of Flora of Scotland. And he would often write little bits of extra information about how plants were used. Sometimes it was the way they were used very widespread. So he says out of the soft rush that it's used to make wicks for candles, which was a very widespread practice. But also mentions something that you don't really hear written down so much, that the pith of it was used to make toy baskets. So you get these little insights into ways that people were using plants beyond just the norm. So rushwick lights were widespread, but little toy baskets was just a little thing that people would do. It's a little extra you get. And then Carmichael, who was a fascinating character, so a tax collector, a native Gaelic speaker, but interestingly a quite popular tax collector. One of the things that he did was he collected a whole host of songs and stories about all kinds of different topics in Gaelic, and then translated them into English along with various other people. And they're often quite flowery translations, but they're chock full of lots of references to how people use plants in particular for some of the stories and the poems. But he also wrote little extra notes. So he puts things in there like, in the outer aisles, for want of better material, the stem of the ragwort was used for making creel. It was also used as a switch for cows, horses, and children. So if you had any sort of wayward livestock or slightly badly behaved teenagers, you could just give them a wee sort of smack on the arm or something like that, or on the haunches with a bit of ragweed, and that would set them right. But interesting to hear, because there's that relatively sparse tree cover and sometimes no tree cover for the kind of Western Isles, people had to make do with what material there was. And the tough stalks of ragweed were probably pretty good for temporary creels and baskets to be made from. And I'll maybe just mention a little bit, I'll come back to names again, but I just thought I'd mention this in passing. This is some of the work we're doing, trying to collate together lots and lots of names in Scots and in English and in Gaelic as well. And for these 1,000 or maybe 1,200 species, you can imagine a whole host of them are just little green sedges. They might be carex sedges or lots of grasses and things. They only have one name, one official name. Okay, and there's maybe only about 200 plants that have got more than one name in each of the languages. So amongst these 200 plants, we've collated as much as we can for all these names, and we've got 9,000 different names. So for 200 plants in this quite small country, with these 3 languages or dialects in some cases, we've got 9,000 names. And it just shows how regionally all these different names and different groups of people were applying different names to plants. So you get such delights as this. This is Petasites, and it's probably most common name is butterbur, because these big leaves were used to wrap up butter. It's kind of rhubarb-like plant. And it's known in some areas as flapper bags, which is great because when that leaf dies and collapses towards the end of the summer, it looks like old plastic bags. So people call this flapper bags. Perfect. And then everybody hopefully knows what this is down on the right. This is taraxacum. This is dandelion. But you might, I'm pretty sure not many folk, if any, will ever have heard of this. Sounds ruder than it is, I promise. It's bum pipe. Okay, which, shocking as it sounds, isn't as rude as you can imagine. I'm pretty much one of the very, very few people that can explain this to me is my dad, who grew up in Coatbridge. And it's because bum, around that bit of Lanarkshire, is actually hum. So you might have come across bumblebees as being foggy bummers. And it's because they bumble about going bum, 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 because in that part of Lanarkshire, it's not considered humming, considered bum. And it's because you can take the stalk of the inflorescence, the stalk of the flower head of taraxacum, you can break off the yellow flowers and throw them away. And when you take the stalk, you've got that tube, that thin tube, and you can blow through it and make a noise like a kazoo. And that's a classic thing. Lots and lots of children's games are sources for names of these plants as well. So as I say, we've got about 200 or so plants with almost 9,000 different names attached to them. Quite intriguing indeed. And lots of them, are there any? Lots of them are slightly risky, I have to say. So we may need to edit things when we're thinking about that. So I thought we'd do a quick tour just from the coast and make our way up to the mountains, and then we'll have a wee look at just a few little uses for plants in sort of more urban areas as well, a bit of a kind of biome-based thing. So Amophila area is one of the plants that's used in kind of weaving and in basketry. This is a kind of marram grass, but particularly in the Northern Isles. Just one mentioned in passing to see. And then we've got these things here, so the algae. So not plants, but a really fascinating, incredibly diverse group of organisms in marine areas, and obviously really important for coastal communities, presumably from Middle Stone Age, Mesolithic times, right through until the present day. And you know, if you would go maybe only even 50 years ago or so to the fishmonger, you might well get a bit of seaweed with your fish as well. So often these used to dress and keep fish moist. But there's a whole host of different seaweeds here, and most of them are quite useful. So on the far right hand side, this dark kind of blackish olive thing is Ascophyllum nodosum. This is the knotted rack or egg rack, and that's the classic one that was used for fertilizers, so collected in big quantities. And when you see the run rigs on the west coast in particular, very often it's large quantities of this big brown seaweed that were used to be the fertilizer dug into the soil. You've got the small carrageen, so this one here, which I don't know if you can make that out, but it's the kind of smallish one near the top right with kind of brown and yellow. And that was used for making carrageen pudding. So drop it into, well, wash it first, drop it into milk, and the compounds that are in there would act essentially as kind of a vegetarian gelatin. And you might have made it yourself. It can make a kind of a posset in the milk, or you can thicken it up and make quite a bit of a jelly. And because these compounds are quite inert, they don't interact, we can't digest them very well, and they were used typically as an invalid food. So you would have carrageen pudding made with milk and kind of thickened up with this after you'd been ill and been sick, because it would tend to stay down quite well. And if you ever made carrageen pudding, it's almost supernatural how bland it is. So people would put vinegar or lemon and pepper or other strong flavors in to flavor it up a bit. And I've made it with curry powder in the past, and you have to put 1.5 tons of curry powder in order to get any hint of flavor from it. It's quite supernatural almost. We've got the green sea lettuce down in the bottom left here, and we've got on the left hand side sugar kelp or sugar rack, and these are both delightfully edible things. In this one here, I don't know if you can make out, that's making its way down towards the bottom right though, is maybe the most famous of the edible seaweeds in Scotland. This is dulse, and this is it here growing in life. Now you can harvest it and from clean areas and just eat it raw, or it was traditionally taken and wrapped around a stick and roasted over a fire, because it's fairly close to nori, the same seaweed that you'll get on the outside of sushi. So it behaves in the same kind of way. It kind of goes green and crispy, gives you quite a similar flavour. It's not the closest relative we have to nori, but quite close indeed. But it was also used for some pretty weird and wonderful things as well in obstetrics. So this is Martin writing at the end of the 1600s, saying a large handful of the sea plant dulse growing upon stone being applied outwardly, as is mentioned above, takes away the afterbirth with great ease and safety. This remedy is to be repeated until it produce the desired effect, although some hours may be intermittent. The fresher the dulse is, the operation is the stronger, for if it's above 2 or 3 days old, little is to be expected from it in this case. This plant seldom or never fails of success, though the patient had been delivered of several days before. And of this I've lately seen an extraordinary instance in Edinburgh in Scotland, where the patient was given over as dead. And that's fascinating, is the idea that if the afterbirth wasn't being flushed out after a baby had been born, people would take a big handful of this seaweed and drop it on the stomach of the mother, and that would help to cause the afterbirth to be passed and save her life, essentially. And you don't get that recorded anywhere else. We don't know why. We don't know how the idea was invented at all. There's a slight suspicion, but again, it's dangerous to speculate, that maybe because the plant looks a little bit like placenta, it might actually have been one of these ideas of the doctrine of signatures, where you can use a plant to cure an illness that it looks like. So this kind of concept through that's been with us for maybe 1,500, 2,000 years or so, more than that. But interestingly, around this time, in the late 1600s, the doctrine of signatures began to kind of fall out of favour, which is quite intriguing to see. I slightly suspect it's because if you ever had a huge big lump of seaweed dropped on your stomach, your stomach would pretty much contract and would flush anything out successfully. So yeah, really quite intriguing indeed, but again, not mentioned anywhere else. And then this is a real big one. This is the brown seaweeds. And we think, we're not sure, but probably a mix of lots of different big chunky brown seaweeds, of course, were burned in huge quantities to produce kelp ash. And being really mineral rich, it produced a really mineral rich end product. And that mineral rich end product was used for bleaching linen, for making soda glass. It was used as a fertilizer, quite an alkaline fertilizer, really versatile. And of course, it was very valuable. So the lairds around the coasts of many of the Gaelic-speaking parts and up in the Northern Isles as well, encouraged all the crofters and the tenants on the land to burn lots of seaweed. And it made the lairds very, very rich indeed. Didn't make the peasantry, if you like, around the coasts any richer at all. It was that classic kind of exploitation. But of course, when the bottom fell out of the industry, when alternative sources of these things were found, like guano or other kind of chemical processes for isolating iodine, which is one of the other things it was used for, the bottom fell out of the industry, and the lairds realised we can't make any more money from this. We need to do something else with our land. Not, of course, let people farm it and use it at all. They went instead to sheep, and they brought sheep on. And in fact, it was the failure of the kelp industry that probably precipitated the sheep coming on to maintain that lifestyle of the lairds that then forced the Highland clearances, which is really quite intriguing. So this kind of over-reliance on a plant-based industry shaped a large proportion of the Scottish diaspora. It's really quite sort of fundamental. But people, of course, nowadays are looking at lots of ways in which seaweeds could be used in the future. There's lots of interesting potential, really interesting compounds in them. So we'll move away from seaweeds and onto some flowering plants. And the most interesting one in this really lovely little kind of coastal turf picture here by Morna Henderson is down on the bottom right-hand side, the one with these little sort of spoon-shaped leaves. And this is scurvy grass. And of course, lots and lots of plants contain high proportions of vitamin C. And this was a classic coastal one that people would eat because you could be sailing around, not have access to lots of fresh foodstuffs, but you could, no matter where you stopped, if you found scurvy grass, it was reliable, easy to identify, high vitamin C content, And if you were lucky, it tasted like the most delicious fresh rocket. If you're unlucky, it tastes like eating mustard gas. Well, maybe that's a bit excessive, but it was a really high mustard oil content. But it's quite pleasant and easy to identify. So people used it all the time as one of these kind of foodstuffs that also had a medicinal benefit, a really important medicinal benefit. Unfortunately, if you've ever had rocket and put it in the back of your fridge and try and store it, you know how it goes all black and mushy. I think that's the main reason they didn't use scurvy grass, and they instead turned to citrus fruit for supplying the Navy with anti-scorbutic and anti-scurvy things. So Martin again writes a really wonderful thing about scurvy grass. He says that this rock, which is a rock off St Kilda, affords a great quantity of scurvy grass of an extraordinary size and very thick. The natives eat it frequently as well boiled as raw. 2 of them told me they'd happened to be confined there for the space of 30 hours by a contrary wind, and being without victuals fell to eating this scurvy grass. And finding it of a sweet taste far different from the land scurvy grass, they ate a large basketful of it, which did abundantly satisfy their appetites until their return home. And they told me also that it was not the least windy or any other way troublesome. It's lovely. I just love that. It sort of Martin was a trained physician, and he was actually commissioned by Sibbald, co-founder of the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, and also co-founder of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh, to go to the Gaelic speaking areas, because Martin was a native Gaelic speaker, and find out what people were doing. And he documented a huge amount of really interesting things. So it's well worth reading Martin's books. But it's quite sort of telling about how medical diagnostics worked at the time, that Martin does talk a lot about flatulence. And it's because, of course, looking at and listening to the symptoms of what's happening in your stomach and your abdomen more generally, were some of the most useful ways for telling what was happening in the body. Temperature, kind of colour and things like that were what you had. You didn't have MRI scans or any of the really sophisticated techniques that we have now. But really intriguingly, last week, there was a bit of a study had come out that said that GPs should pay a lot of attention to what's happening abdominally. And if people are feeling bloating or lots of kind of abdominal symptoms, that we should be paying more attention to this. So it's really interesting to hear that this 250, 300-year-old kind of approach to diagnostic medicine was actually really quite sound indeed. So we'll move on to wetlands, moving up the rivers, and you can see this kind of classic bit of streamside habitat. And in the foreground here, and to the right-hand side, we've got alder. So this is Ulmus glutinosa, the classic plant that grows very well by streamsides and has very, very resilient wood. So it was always the one that was used for crannog posts. Or if you get down to the National Museum of Scotland, they've got an absolutely exquisite, very large diameter bucket that people suggest is a bigger diameter than many of the alders that we have around today, that's carved out of a single piece of alder. And it was used to store butter. So people would take these alder buckets and fill it up with butter, put the top on, seal it with wax, and then sink it into a bog. And in doing that, you could preserve butter for a very, very long time, these so-called bog butter buckets. Really quite wonderful. So very practical, pragmatic things. You could build your lake houses out of it. You could store butter in it, but also it was considered cursed. So when you cut down an alder, you had to make particularly kind of apologetic sort of sayings and phrases to it that were recorded quite nicely by Alexander Carmichael. And the reason for that is, of course, alder has blood in it. So when you cut alder, if you look at the wood, it has this lovely red hue, and that was interpreted as blood. And of course, anything like that, it's because it must have been to do with the crucifixion. It's its guilt having been used to make the wood of the crucifix was the interpretation for it. Now, it goes without saying that there's probably about 17, 18, 20 different plants or so that have been blamed for being the wood of the crucifixion. Even in Britain as well, things like aspen with the leaves that tremble in the wind, they're supposed to be unable to stop speaking with guilt because they were the one that was used for making the crucifix as well. You get these really quite interesting bits of associations with them, sort of Christian folklore, if you like, as well. So yeah, a really fascinating plant in alder. And then this is another lovely little wetland thing, which I think maybe many of you will have seen. This is butterwort, and it gets its name from its use, quite widespread throughout much of its range, in making butter. So because this is a little carnivorous plant, you can take the little rosettes and drop them into milk, and it will curdle the milk, and that's the kind of first process in both cheese and butter making degree. So that's where it gets this butterwort name. And in Scots, it's called earn grass. So that in kind of a northern sort of Scots dialect, it's earning grass. So the thing that curdles milk. And equalgirse and yearningirse are sort of more Norse Scots interpretations of the same kind of meaning. But you also get a different facet to its names as well, and that's things like rock grass and sheeproot as well. And these are a bit more sinister, and it's the idea that if you take your sheep up and they eat any of this plant at all when they're out on pasture, then they get this horrible wasting disease in their hooves. And this poor plant was blamed very badly for this disease that happened in livestock. But of course, if you take your sheep and put them on pasture in a bog where this plant grows, they're going to get foot rot, aren't they? It's nothing to do with the poor plant. I wouldn't blame that at all. But it was interpreted as being the source for this kind of problem that sheep would have. But it does have a kind of good supernatural side as well, in that it's a bit of a tough one to tell, but a plant called Moan, this that you see here in Gaelic, is recorded by Alexander Carmichael as being used to make hoops out of the roots that were tucked under sort of butter buckets, or you would put them in the byre or near where the cattle were sleeping, and it would help to protect against the fairy folk or witchcraft from damaging or stealing the butter. So we're not sure, because the identifications of these plants aren't always great. And the root on Pinguicula vulgaris, the little butterwort, is quite small. So it's quite a job to make a little hoop out of that. Yeah, fascinating thing. On a pragmatic note, we've got things like this. This is the Gallium verum, lady's bedstraw, and it's a classic kind of grassland plant of quite dry grasslands. And some of the best habitats you can find it in are the macher. Although this here is on Arthur's Seat, it's a widespread plant you'll find in many places. Grows in sunny spots. But on the macher and other kind of sandy habitats, if you pull up all the plants, of course, it ends up exposing the sand, the wind comes in, and you get erosion. Now, the problem with Gallium verum, with lady's bedstraw, it's one of the best sources for red dye. And red dye was quite a premium dye, and the red dye, of course, was in the roots. In fact, this is in the Rubiaceae family, so quite closely related to Rubia tinctoria, which is madder, which was the main source of red dye. And indeed, rubia and rubus, and Rubiaceae refers to that red coloration. And that unfortunately meant that even in the 1500s, people were over harvesting this and taking so much of it out of sandy soils that it would end up precipitating and causing erosion. And there was an edict put out by the king that said you must stop collecting this because we're losing too much land to people harvesting it. But if you wanted to look good and have good red clothes, this was your main source of dye. And then this, another little grassland plant. This is a bitter vetch here. This is Lathyrus linifolius. And I could probably talk for 18 hours on this thing. It's a really quite wonderful wee plant, but I'll just quickly say that these tubers that you can see there that the plants are growing out of are one of the most intriguing things in kind of Scottish traditional plant lore. There's lots of mentions of them having been dug up and chewed, and they have a bit of a kind of slight licorice taste, but people would chew them in order to keep themselves alert and awake. So a little bit like people might chew coca leaves in the Andes is the implication. And over time, there were more things ascribed to it. So it was also used genuinely as a flavouring for whiskey. So you would mash them up and then put them into whiskey, and it would give this sort of light anise fragrance, quite pleasant indeed. However, over time, particularly as non-Gaelic speaking recorders came, they added lots of extra sort of attributions to this, and it ended up that you could eat one of these and it would completely get rid of the effects of drunkenness, and a whole host of other things. And it could make you practically superhuman if you ate them. And the records get more and more kind of inflated as you go through time. Quite intriguing to see. So I'd always treat these accounts with a bit of a pinch of salt. But yeah, a fascinating plant, really quite wonderful. And that brings us to woodlands, where you've got things like ferns, a huge diversity of ferns in woodlands, and it almost didn't matter which species you looked at. They were typically used as, but this was the main one. And actually, in fact, the Dryopteris here was grown right through until the early 1900s. And just across from the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, there was large plantations of Dryopteris that were used to make anti-helminthics. So if you had intestinal parasites, you could have a fern-based pill, and it would kill off any of the worms you had in your intestine. So if you had things like threadworms or tapeworms, that was your go-to medicine. Very effective, but you had to get the dose right because it was pretty toxic indeed. And on the other end of the scale, something much more tasty is Oxalis acetosella, this little wood sorrel there, which if you've ever had it, has that lovely kind of apple green fresh taste to it. Other edibles are things like ramsons. So on the left-hand side, we've got the classic kind of wild bear garlic here. And like many of these other things that were often thought of as what we think of as superfoods today, when people were eating wild garlic, but also onions and kind of commercial Mediterranean garlics as well, they often thought that was good for kidney stones as well. So it was a classic thing you would have if you had kidney stones. But you could also chop it up, add it to butter, and use it as a poultice to draw pus out, was one of the classic things. And then on the right-hand side, we've got Arum maculatum, which is cuckoo pine. And quite a common woodland plant for fairly shady areas, but not one to eat, but it was eaten. So in famine times, the tuber at the bottom of Lords and Ladies was a really popular, if you like, and necessary foodstuff. So it's quite starchy, but it also contains a lot of calcium oxalate crystals. So if you ate any part of this plant, your mouth would start to tingle and burn. And lots of foragers have tried to recreate various recipes where they dig up the tubers of these and they'll pound them up and they'll wash them and they'll roast them and do a whole host of different things in order to try and see if the flour that you get out of the end doesn't have that tingly kind of scratchy kind of taste to it, if you like. And seemingly it never works. It always has that kind of effect. And it's just basically that if you were desperate in famine times, you would probably put up with eating something very, very uncomfortable like this, because that's all you had for food stuff. It's quite an intriguing one. So don't eat that at home, I have to say, under any circumstances. Okay. And then you've got things like this, another wonderful wee woodland, and a kind of open woodland margin plant. This is very popular and sort of well known, and known as a successful antidepressant, but it has these kind of interactions with other commercial medicines that can make it quite dangerous for use, but it's effective. And it's great because it's St. John's wort throughout many parts of Europe, or its equivalent, but in Scotland it's Columba's plant. So whoever the main heroic saint was locally, that's who this would be associated with, because it was almost treated with a kind of religious reverence for its effect. Because of its antidepressant effect, that was often interpreted as being something that could be useful in counteracting the effects of being beset by devils. And that was often what it was. It was thought to be kind of not demonic possession, but that influence of kind of unclean spirits was what was making people have these kind of psychiatric issues. And by using this plant, it would help to chase those away and make people feel better. But interestingly, it has a use in Scotland, or a kind of a way of administration in Scotland, where you would take the plant and you would sew a bit into your armpit, because as you were walking along, your sweaty, often hairy armpit would kind of rub this plant around, and because the skin on the underside of your armpit is considered to be quite thin, they thought that might have been quite an effective way for getting the compounds into your system. Now we're not sure if that's true or not, but certainly people did use to put it under their armpits. So we're doing okay. I think we won't be too much longer. This is just one I put in because mushrooms were used for almost nothing at all. There's a few uses for them, but I just thought I'd put this in because this is done by Fran Thomas here, and it uses the ink from an ink cap mushroom to illustrate itself, which I think has come out really, really nice indeed. It's great. And we'll hop on to a bit more upland areas and a little look at stag's horn club moss. This is a lovely plant, this. It's a non-flowering plant, fairly common in upland kind of gravelly soils. And it was used, the spores of it, for dusting powders, for pills and latex gloves, because it stopped the gloves from sticking to each other. But before that, it was also used as a kind of supernatural protection. So if you were out walking in the hills and you came across this plant, you could take a portion of it and apparently tuck it into your shoe, and it would help protect you against the effects of elf shot or the fairy folk's arrows. And it's difficult to know, but possibly because up in similar parts of the hills, you would often find little stone arrowheads, so Neolithic stone arrowheads. They were thought to be the arrowheads of the fairy folk because the fairy folk couldn't touch iron. They had to use stone. It's this interesting interpretation of this concept of the fairy folk. And of course, these arrows, they had an invisible shaft and no feathers on them because they were just arrowheads. And people thought that those were things that had been fired by the fairy folk and would cause illness or disaster, or it'd be quite dangerous things. But apparently, if you had a bit of stag's horn club moss in your shoe, you'd be fine, and your journey would go on without a problem. And we don't know why this plant in particular. It's got no real obvious anti sort of fairy folk protection at all, but yeah, or hint in its appearance at all. So intriguing things, definitely, but quite a local one, that. And then this is a similar one, of course. This is probably the one that I guess most people, like a large proportion of people, still retain, and will often have a rowan outside their front door in order to keep away witches. And we've got a big trial underway at the garden, like an empirical double-blind trial, where we're bringing in lots of witches, and we're testing whether or not they can actually pass rowan trees. But we're still in the trial stages for that, of course, I have to say. But what's interesting, you get even James VI, James I, mentioning this plant in his demonology, where he says in the debate over whether or not these sort of day-to-day little bits of magic that everybody was kind of doing, whether or not that's actually heretical, you kind of like an evil practice, because he mentions that the kind of, as he puts it, the commonly daft wifey weaving rowan trees into circles, is that an evil act or not? And he's debating kind of internally with that in one of his books. And what people would do is they'd make hoops out of rowan and then drive the livestock between the hoops or through hoops or between a hoop and a fire, and that would help to purify them and to kind of get rid of the influence of any witchcraft, and of course make sure their milk was bountiful and good as well. And that brings us to our most recent habitat and our final one, just with a few things. And I think that's one of the things that people often forget, is that human habitats and the human biome are actually surprisingly diverse and varied. There's a lot going on in this little patch of kind of like former building site. There's a lot there. Of course, we've domesticated a few crops, but not many at all from the native flora. But one of these is maybe Sutherland kale. So that's just an image of Brassica rapa, one kind of cultivar of it. And then we've got a couple more ferns here. So this just happens to be two that are often found in urban habitats. And they're beautifully referenced again by Martin Martin, who mentions that spleenwort and hart's tongue were, it's just a short couple of sentences. He said that the two of these were brewed together into a beer in order to combat consumption. That's all you get, a couple of sentences. But intriguingly, consumption is a form of TB. And it might be that there is something in some of the compounds that are there that would be effective in combating tuberculosis. And that's what I find particularly intriguing, is where there are some hints of things just in a little sentence here or there that really beg to be investigated a bit more deeply indeed. So there is potential, I think, for some really quite intriguing treatments and medicinal uses for these plants in the future. And I, for one, would definitely have a pint if it would help to fend off tuberculosis. I would step up to the plate for that. And then something as innocuous and kind of often kind of demonized as the nettle was incredibly versatile as well. But we're back with Martin Martin again. He says that the tops of nettles, chopped small and mixed with a few whites of raw eggs, applied to the forehead and temples by way of a frontal, is used to procure sleep. A nice local little use there. And on Gia, some of the natives told him that they used to chew nettles and hold them to their nostrils to staunch bleeding at the nose, and that nettles being applied to the place would also stop the bleeding at a vein or otherwise. There's some quite little intriguing, again, very, very local uses there that you wouldn't find more widespread. And it's just people making use of what plants were about, experimenting with them, sometimes having a belief in them that wasn't necessarily supported, and sometimes maybe finding some really quite intriguing little uses for these plants as well. We haven't tested them all. I wouldn't recommend many of these uses at home. And I thought I'd just finish with a bit of symbolism, I guess. So this is just a couple of images of the same species. This is the large, chunky spear thistle, Cirsium vulgare, which is often thought of as the main sort of heraldic plant for Scotland, I guess. So this wonderfully abstract kind of ink piece here, and then a much more kind of photorealistic piece here by Claire McGee. And you can see how that is quite significantly convincing as the heraldic species for Scotland, but there's been quite a bit of debate over what was the right thistle species. And the other big contender is a Mediterranean species called Onopordon acanthium, a really tall, woolly thistle. I can't remember its main common name, but it has a wider head, and that's a bit more like the one you would see on sort of coins, for example, quite often on heraldry, and a kind of much chunkier head as well. And I think it's possibly a good contender because we're going to have to go back to the scurrilous here, because Onopordon, although it's Mediterranean, its name translated over from Greek means the donkey's fart. And it's because it's the one that donkeys would eat and it would make them flatulent. And I get a tear in my patriotic eye when I think that possibly our thistle, our heraldic thistle, should be related to the donkey's fart. Why not? I'm sure. But no, I think this is the more convincing one because it's the true native. And I just thought I'd finish up with a little mention of all the myriad artists that contributed to the book that's associated with this. It was just amazing to be able to work with them and to call upon their expertise and find so many different styles in terms of artistic interpretation of our native flora. And I'm always bad at this bit, but you can, it's available now if you're at all interested in it. But it was a great pleasure to work with all these people to produce this book. So yeah, many thanks indeed, folks. I hope that's okay for time. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. I might leave up the presentation for now in case we want to jump back to any pictures at all. There we go.
Well, Greg, thanks very much for that. That's got us all thinking. A question I was going to ask to set the ball rolling: are you involved with any, or is the Botanic Garden involved with any medical projects to test any of these remedies?
We are through the last 20 or so years. There's been lots of little projects that pop up, and we're usually the advisors for how to find the plants, what the plants are, and then it would be other groups that could take them on from here. So things like that little bitter vetch. We had a really interesting project looking at some of the kind of components in there, which and it's of course it's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to really uncover what's going on. But I would say just be a bit cautious, people, about eating that plant in any kind of quantity, because there's some interesting stuff in there that probably you should be careful with. I think nothing psychoactive or anything, but it can be can have potential for doing some sort of interesting long-term stuff potentially. So I mean, the problem with plants is, of course, if you want to find a chemical in a plant, it will probably be there in a way. They're so varied. We've also got some quite nice stuff looking at other natives for their potential for anti-inflammatory and kind of anti-cancer properties as well. But we tend to pass them on to other groups to do the more technical human side of the research as well. Yeah, some really fascinating things, but there's still many, many more areas to explore.
Good, good. There are lots of questions now being put up on the chat function. Are you able to see the chat yourself, Greg?
I wonder if I can actually. Let's see if I can get up to. Oh yeah, I can actually. Well, yes. Perfect. So I might go. Let's see, to the earliest ones of these. Is that the right direction?
Yeah, the earliest at the top, I think.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's Claire just asking if Martin Martin's book's available, and can I give the title? So it is. I'm sure it's still in print, and it's A Voyage to the Western Isles. And do I have a copy just about here that I can grab? No, maybe not. Thing somewhere behind my computer, I think. But oh, there we go. There's one here. You can also get it, I'm sure, online. So if you have a look, so it's sorry, a description of the Western Isles of Scotland, and yep, it's kind of downloadable as a PDF as well. So you won't be able to see that in any detail, but the whole thing's there. So I'm sure you can track that down just online. It's a really fascinating. But I'm realizing that I've actually probably over-focused on quotes from Martin, but many of the others, like the Carmina Gadelica, also available online as a downloadable thing, have got some really fascinating kind of elements as well.
Is Carmina Gadelica still in print? It used to be.
I think it was reissued fairly recently, but when I say fairly recently, maybe 15 years ago.
Right.
So I don't know if it's currently in print. As I say, you can find it online, all the volumes of the kind of expanded edition, which is quite nice indeed. And you'll certainly get second-hand copies. But there was a kind of a reduced kind of edited version. Lots of really interesting. Look at that. How convenient is this?
Yes.
Sitting here, just tucked in. Sorry, I'll grab that out. But yes, this is an issue just behind here. There we are.
Yes. Raw with a glossy cover. I used to have a copy myself. I lent it to somebody. I've never seen it since.
That's tragic. Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, that often happens. So yeah, but this is just chock full of really interesting things. But as I say, flowery translations. But that adds to the kind of interest.
Yes.
So we've got Francis asking if it's possible to maintain a forest vegan diet in Perth Bay, and I think for summertime and through spring and some parts of autumn, I think it might be possible to do that. But the big challenge is always winter, I think, for accessing things. So yeah, foraging is certainly something that is quite surprisingly doable. But I guess the danger is when competition appears, quite how much there is in terms of the finite resource that's out there for people to use. But yeah, I think it would be feasible through the more forgiving months, but once you get into wintertime, it is quite challenging, I think. And oh yeah, great. So so this is just to be mentioned there from Mary to everybody, saying that when you lived in North Ronaldsay in the mid to late 80s, kelp stems were still being harvested, collected, and sent to alginate factory. Was that maybe in Ayr? There was an alginate factory in Ayr where people extracted alginate and then used for cosmetics and ice cream. Absolutely, that's just great, yeah. And it was useful as extra income for the crofters. And you're saying your husband collected a relatively small amount, which financed a rocking horse for your daughter. That's superb. That's really good. That's good. And then there we go. And Francis just mentioned St John's wort's a wee bit dangerous as an enzyme inducer, making some medications run out of steam before they should, like contraceptives, for example. And interesting and important to know the potentials. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly that's something it had a popular period maybe a few years ago, but I think folk recognised there was that kind of contraindications and kind of interactions with other medicines that was an issue. And Teresa saying as towns and cities grew, people became separate from plant browsing and gathering, which was natural to your average villager. City folk would only have access to easy grown crops easily brought into town. So we town folk gradually lost touch with our natural foraging past. It's sad this talk illustrates our separateness from our natural environment. And I would completely agree. I think possibly more so than any other country I've ever been in. And of course, it's an urban element in there as well, but actually even more widely very often we are more separated than many other countries. If you compare just over the North Sea up into Sweden and Norway, the way that plants are used and managed in the landscape as well, kind of quite superbly, to be able to produce, the classic one is lingonberry. So lingonberry, I guess it probably is, I suspect, a bit over harvested now in Latvia, Estonia, and in Sweden. But that, of course, is used for a whole host of interesting jams and juices and everything like that, and jellies. But we only really know it, unless we're out in the hills and know how to identify it. We only ever really know it as that red juice that you can buy in IKEA. And when I explain that to people, that it comes from this plant here on a kind of sort of semi-industrial scale, it blows their minds. Quite an intriguing one indeed. So yeah, you're saying you gather nettles from my garden every spring. Oh yeah, and make lovely detox soup. And that's quite intriguing. So nettles were one of these things, absolutely, that particularly through May, which seems a bit late for me compared to when I'd expect. Every single community had its different take on nettle tonic. You'd have these nettle soup or some similar tonic, and you would have to have it a certain thing. So at the start, every Monday through May, you would have your nettle tonic, and that was just almost this kind of ritualistic thing, just that you were set up for the working the year ahead. But as I say, I always find it a bit odd that was May rather than something like through April when nettles were first flushing and you would kind of want to be coming out of winter. Quite an intriguing one. And is there a Perth plant that's famous for any reason? There are certainly in Perthshire itself, and I'd love to hear from everyone else for this actually, but Perthshire itself is one of the ones where we've got lots of our relative rarities. So things like Paris quadrifolia, that little Paris, herb Paris with its 4 leaves. There's really nice colonies of that in Perthshire, and that's one of the plants that was supposedly you could use to open up locks and to trick woodpeckers into. You would trick a woodpecker into going and collecting the herb for you. I think that was in Iceland that was kind of done. So don't go and harvest it because it's a rare plant, of course, and it won't work for opening up any locks, but has this quite interesting little kind of association. And I suppose the other bit, the Perth and Perthshire widely are really quite interesting for quite a lot of non-natives that pop up possibly through the farming thing. And it's the only place, my speciality for research is, aside from this, is Lathyrus, the vetches and the sweet peas. And it's the only place in Scotland that a plant called Lathyrus niger has ever been found. And for many, many years, it was thought that it was native, but actually we've got the plant in the herbarium in Edinburgh. We think it's just a one-off that came in with a batch of seed or something and popped up somewhere near a farm in Perthshire. And since then, it's always been thought of as native, but it probably wasn't at all. Does anyone else know any kind of particularly famous Perth plants at all? No. But yeah, I can have a think, have a bit of a ponder, but lots of good rarities in the local area for sure. And then Colin McLeod's asking, nearly all the artists are women, and why is that? And that's a tough one to know, actually. I think for that was a call out as part of a very, very large global exhibition that was done and organised by the American Society of Botanical Artists. And we put the call out, and I suspect through many of the people that we know locally, through the Botanic Garden, who come and do courses with us in many cases, but it went out beyond, and it was for each group of artists in their own country to illustrate their own native flora. So I think lots of different countries took part. And in Scotland, it happened to be that it was lots of women that responded there. So yeah, it's always a bit of a mystery to me for things. So it's in part it's because I know I'm going to do my botanical illustration when I retire. But Jeffrey, who's on the call here as well, I know he's a great botanical illustrator as well. Okay, and then how did I get inspired to look so closely at plants. It's really refreshing to hear my thoughts and studies. Thanks very much. That's it. So I think the main inspiration for me for plants was, if you remember the picture I showed of that patch of urban diversity. So I lived in North Fife, which was not urban by any means, but we had a failed building site behind us when I was a child. And because you could climb over the garden wall and go through the old sewers, and the sort of the brand new clean sewers that had never been finished, and there was there was mice and all kinds of interesting stuff, and just really interesting plants in this kind of run-down seeming area, and you could see the diversity was there. That was really quite interesting. And every time I've ever had a teacher that for biology or anything like that kind of thing, they would very often have a botanical background, and they were always the ones that had a strange twinkle in their eye. Interestingly, it looked like they enjoyed what they were doing. So I think that was maybe the main inspiration. And yeah, nice. So Herb Majesty there is asking, can we eat thistle flowers? And you can indeed. So like artichokes, it's the same kind of idea for that flower head. So I mean, normally what you would do is you would take out the flowers, and then you've got the bits at the bottom called the receptacle, and that would be, it's kind of called the receptacle, but it's the bit where you've got the pad sitting inside that cup of really spiny bracts around the outside. But take out the flowers, take off the spiny bracts, and that little bit in the bottom was actually called cheesies in the past, and it was perfectly edible and much like artichokes. So it's the same actual structure, just artichokes are a bit like spiny, and called cheesies because it's got that kind of texture, a bit like kind of cheese. Quite interesting. Okay. And then Claire's asking, we're all aware now of plant diseases brought with plants from elsewhere. Do we know if any diseases were brought in with some of the earlier introductions you mentioned? So I'm not sure, actually. That's a really kind of good point, just that whole biosecurity, moving these pathogens around. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if things were introduced with these early things, but I don't know if anyone's investigated it. I think quite a bit of that kind of, like, I suppose, genetic investigation of pathogens is still in its relative infancy. So I don't know if folk have looked at that for what's happening or happened sort of 300, 400 years ago. But I'm trying to think if there's any kind of records of it at all. It wouldn't surprise me. Anyway, certainly with woody plants, with trees being moved around, you could expect pathogens and pests to be brought in. There we are. Oh yes, so physicists of a certain age may recall lycopodium powder to estimate the size of oil molecules. Excellent, that's great. I don't think I've done that one. I've got, this is quite a good, but I can't do it indoors on, because we've had, you know, the new smoke alarm rules that are about. It means probably I'll set off some kind of smoke alarm, but this exquisite contraption here, which is covered in lycopodium powder. So these are spores of lycopodium. Just there, wonderful stuff. You can drop it into water, and because it's hydrophobic, it'll sit on the surface. You can push your finger in, and it doesn't get wet at all. But this thing here, this contraption's a bulb with the lycopodium powder in the bottom, and then a lighter. And this was the classic thing that people maybe still use a bit for stage magic. And well, I might just try it. You see that?
Yes.
If the smoke alarm goes off, don't worry, it's not real. But really quite impressive indeed. It's great. So this was another use for lycopodium powder.
Yes. Was that not traditionally used in photography as well?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So it's an incredibly versatile thing. And it keeps away the effects of elf shot as well. So pretty useful. Can't be attacked by the fairy folk. And yeah, but for the size of oil molecules, is that because lycopodium powder is so, I don't know if you want to unmute at all, message, but the lycopodium powder, the spores are so uniform in size. I think that's one of the kind of the key things. But I've never.
I remember doing this at school. You scatter powder on the surface of the water, drop a measured amount of oil on the surface. It spreads out and expels the lycopodium. You measure the diameter of the clear area, and you assume the oil spot is one molecule thick. And then you do a calculation that
Right,
tells you
right.
the physical size of the oil molecule.
Excellent. Right. I'll need to give that a shot. I'll try it at some point to see if we can. That's great. And then seaweed's used for placental detachment expulsion applied to the stomach or into the birth canal. So it was external. So I say the stomach, but a bit lower down, so on the kind of lower abdomen where the womb would be. So it's explicit there that it's external. So I think just dropped onto the abdomen, and that would help to flush the afterbirth. It's quite, yeah, an intriguing one, that indeed, I have to say. And then Susan's just asking, where can you find the book to buy, please? And I suspect it's kind of on Amazon and similar, but there's also many local bookshops and things would carry it as well, I suspect. And then Will was saying foraging's fine, but given our population, and I agree, that's one of those ones where I think if everybody shifted to foraging or large numbers, it can be one of these things, particularly for premium things, and mushrooms are the classic example of that, where you could quite easily damage populations. So that's actually a bit of research that's being done from the garden and various other places, is actually looking at what's out there in terms of populations of various things to see what sustainable levels of harvesting might be. But it's quite interesting because unfortunately a lot of people, or fortunately if you like, really aren't interested in it in terms of what the potential is for these things. Yeah.
Yes. I see Tom's hinting that we should perhaps draw the official part of the meeting to a close now.
No
but we
problem.
can carry on unofficially afterwards. So thanks a lot, Greg, and I will ask Claire to give the formal vote of thanks at this point.
Folks, thank you very much.
Okay.
Just a moment till I find you, Claire.
Yeah, I think Tom's got to do something in the background here.
Oh, I do, yes. And so I've got to find Claire Scanlon in the list of participants, and just give me a second.
And he's got to tell me how to do this for next week.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Gosh, you'll have to buy me a coffee for that. Okay, so add spotlight. There's Claire. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Sorry, I'll put that off. That's a bit bright. Well, I learned lots tonight, and I'm sure everybody else did. And David obviously went to a more interesting school than I did. I never got to play with lycopodium powder. So, but yeah, that was fascinating. Thank you. And in terms of buying the book, I think you should be able to order it from the RBGE website as well, because I've definitely seen it on there. But you would have to get it posted out. I'm pretty sure if you ordered it at Waterstones, they'd get it in for people. But that was a real romp through a whole lot of plants from different habitats, which is quite a nice way to do it. I think we've all learned a great deal. I'm sure that if we'd been able to do this in person and you'd brought along a box full of signed copies, you would have been able to sell quite a few of them tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't do that, but maybe another time, come back and talk about plant magic. Hopefully next year we'll get back to a bit more normal. So thank you very much for giving up your time on a Friday evening and answering all our questions, and I'm sure there would be more, but it's a bit difficult to do applause over Zoom, but I'm sure that you can imagine that we're all giving you a big round of applause just now, and thank you again.
Thanks indeed.
Hey, thanks. No, that's great, and wonderful questions there as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Yes.
Okay.